Hello, you are on the Epic Life Stories channel. Today we will listen to a new exciting story. Subscribe to the channel. Enjoy watching. The glob of spit hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Marcus watched in disbelief as it sailed towards him, his mind racing to comprehend the hatred behind the act. Just moments ago he'd been carrying groceries to his new home, excited about the fresh start. Now he stood frozen on his own lawn, facing the contorted face of his neighbor, a man he'd never even spoken to, as the warm saliva splatter across his cheek. Marcus felt a surge of emotions: shock, disgust, anger, but most of all a crushing realization that his dream of a peaceful life in this suburban neighborhood had just shattered. Marcus Johnson took a deep breath as he lifted the last box from his car. The warm Florida sun beat down on his forehead, causing beads of sweat to form along his hairline. At 28 years old, he was finally achieving his dream of home ownership in the peaceful suburb of Oaked, just outside Tampa. As he carried the box labeled kitchen up the driveway, Marcus couldn't help but smile. The tidy houses with their manicured lawns seemed to promise the fresh start he'd been longing for. After years of climbing the corporate ladder in his firm, he was ready to put down roots in a community where he could truly belong. Stepping onto his new porch, Marcus paused to take in the moment. The street was quiet save for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the cheerful chirping of birds. He closed his eyes briefly, savoring the sense of accomplishment that washed over him. "Hey, you there?" The gruff voice shattered Marcus's He turned to see an older white man marching across the lawn next door, his face set in a scowl. The man looked to be in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and a punch that spoke of too many beers and not enough exercise. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone friendly despite the neighbor's hostile approach. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he looked Marcus up and down. "What do you think you're doing here?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm moving in. This is my new home." A sneer crossed the man's face. "Like hell it is. This is a respectable neighborhood. We don't need your kind here." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd encountered racism before, but never so blatantly, and certainly not in what he'd hoped would be his new community. "Excuse me," he managed, his voice tight with disbelief. "You heard me," the man growled, taking another step closer. "I've worked hard to keep this place safe. I was a cop for 30 years and I'm not about to let it go to hell now." Marcus set the box down slowly, his heart pounding. He tried to keep his voice calm as he spoke. "Sir, I don't want any trouble. I have every right to be here. I bought this house fair and square." The cop's face contorted with rage. "Right, you people always talking about your rights. What about our rights?" "The right to live in peace without worrying about crime and drugs moving in. That's enough," Marcus said, firmly straightening to his full height. "You don't know anything about me. I'm a professional. I work in it." And he never got to finish the sentence in a move so swift Marcus barely had time to register it. The man reared back and spat directly in his face. The warm viscous liquid splattered across Marcus's cheek and mouth, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Marcus stood frozen, shock and revulsion wearing within him. The exop glared at him, a mixture of triumph and disgust on his weathered face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he sneered before turning on his heel and stalking back to his own property. As the reality of what had just happened sank in, Marcus felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Anger, humiliation, and a deepest sadness threatened to overwhelm him. He looked around, suddenly aware of curtains twitching in nearby windows. Had anyone else seen? Would anyone come to his aid? With trembling hands, Marcus wiped the spit from his face, fighting the urge to vomit. His mind raced, trying to process the encounter. Should he call the police? But his attacker was an ex-cop. Would they even take him seriously? In that moment, standing on the porch of what was supposed to be his dream home, Marcus felt utterly alone. The peaceful street now seemed menacing, full of hidden dangers and unspoken hostilities. His vision of a fresh start crumbled around him, replaced by the harsh reality of lingering prejudice and hate. As he picked up the box and fumbled for his keys, Marcus struggled to hold back tears. He'd worked so hard to get here, sacrificed so much. Could he really walk away from his dream because of one bitter racist neighbor? But how could he stay knowing that such hatred lived right next door? Marcus stepped inside his new house, the empty room. Suddenly feeling cold and unwelcoming, he set the box down in the barren kitchen, his mind whirling with difficult questions. Should he stand his ground and fight for his right to live here, or was it safer to cut his losses and find somewhere else? As the door closed behind him, Marcus leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of the decision before him feeling almost unbearable. Outside, Life on the suburban street continued as if nothing had happened, but for Marcus Johnson everything had changed. The incident that would reshape not just his life but the entire community had only just begun. Marcus sat on the floor of his new home for what felt like hours, the weight of the incident pressing down on him as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar rooms. He finally pulled himself to his feet. He couldn't let one hateful person destroy everything he'd worked for. With shaky hands he reached for his phone and dialed his sister's number. "Tasha," he said when she answered, his voice cracking, "I need your advice." As Marcus recounted the horrifying encounter, news of the incident spread through Oak like wildfire. Neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation from behind their curtains began to talk, their whispered conversations growing louder with each retelling. By the next morning the quiet suburb was abuzz with activity. As Marcus stepped outside to retrieve his newspaper, he noticed several neighbors pointedly averting their gaze. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Across the street, Linda Pearson, a middle-aged teacher with kind eyes, watched the scene unfold. She'd moved to Oak 5 years ago and had always found it to be a peaceful, if not particularly diverse community. The sight of her new neighbor being treated so coldly made her stomach churn. Taking a deep breath, Linda crossed the street. "Hi there," she called out, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "I'm Linda. I live just over there." She pointed to her house. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Marcus looked at her wearily, still stinging from yesterday's encounter, but Linda's warm smile seemed genuine and he found himself relaxing slightly. "Thanks," he said. "I'm Marcus. It's nice to meet you." As they chatted, Marcus couldn't help but notice other neighbors watching their interaction. Some looked disapproving while others seemed relieved that someone had made the first move. Meanwhile, John Hawkins, the ex-cop who had spat on Marcus, sat in his living room nursing a glass of whiskey. Despite the early hour, his phone had been ringing off the hook all morning, old colleagues warning him that word of the incident was spreading fast. John's daughter Sarah burst through the front door, her face a mask of fury. "Dad," she shouted, "what the hell were you thinking?" John looked up at his 35-year-old daughter, a woman he barely recognized anymore ever since she'd married that liberal professor and moved to the city. It was like she'd forgotten everything he taught her. "You don't understand, Sarah," he growled. "This neighborhood." "No, Dad." Sarah cut him off. "You don't understand. What you did was disgusting and illegal. Do you have any idea how much trouble you could be in?" As the Hawkins family argument escalated, more neighbors began to venture outside, forming small clusters on the sidewalk. The atmosphere was tense, with opinions sharply divided. "We can't let this stand," Mrs. Thompson, an elderly resident, declared to her small group. "This used to be a nice quiet neighborhood." "Exactly," agreed Mr. Foster, a local business owner. "Property values will plummet if we don't nip this in the bud." But not everyone shared their views. Jake Martinez, a young Latino man who'd moved in last year, spoke up. "Are you serious? The only thing damaging this neighborhood is that kind of racist attitude." As debates raged across Oak, Marcus stood on his porch watching it all unfold. He felt simultaneously at the center of the storm and completely isolated from it. Part of him wanted to pack up and leave, to escape the hostile stares and whispered comments, but a larger part, the part that had driven him to succeed against all odds, refused to be chased away. Just as Marcus was about to retreat inside, he noticed a small group approaching his house, led by Linda. The group included Jake, a young couple he didn't recognize, and surprisingly, Sarah Hawkins. "Marcus," Linda called out, her voice firm and clear, "we wanted you to know that what happened yesterday doesn't represent all of us. We're glad you're here and we want you to stay." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope as he invited the small group inside for coffee. He realized that perhaps there was a chance for him in Oak. After all, the road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't alone. Across the street, John Hawkins watched the scene unfold from behind his living room curtain, his face a storm of conflicting emotions as he saw his daughter enter Marcus's house. Something shifted inside him, a tiny crack in the foundation of his long-held beliefs. The incident that had seemed so black and white yesterday was growing more complex by the hour, and for better or worse, life in Oak would never be the same as the small group filed out of Marcus's house. Later that evening, the atmosphere in Oak Ridge remained charged. The impromptu coffee gathering had lasted hours, with Marcus's new allies sharing stories, offering support and strategizing about how to address the community's divided reactions. Sarah Hawkins lingered behind as the others left. "Marcus," she said, her voice low and intense, "I want you to know how sorry I am for what my father did. It's inexcusable. Marcus nodded, appreciating her words but unsure how to respond. As Sarah walked away, he couldn't help but wonder about the man who had shown him such hatred. What could drive someone to act that way? Across the street, John Hawkins watched his daughter's interaction with Marcus from his window, a tumbler of whiskey clutched in his trembling hand. The sight of Sarah emerging from that man's house sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through him. How dare she betray him like this? As the days passed, the initial shock of the incident began to fade, but the tension in Oak Ridge only grew. The neighborhood found itself divided into three distinct camps: those who supported Marcus, those who sided with John, and a nervous middle group who just wanted everything to go back to normal. Linda Pearson took it upon herself to organize a community meeting to address the situation. As she went door to door handing out flyers, she encountered a wide range of reactions, from enthusiastic support to doors slammed in her face. Meanwhile, John Hawkins found himself increasingly isolated. Many of his longtime neighbors, even those who might have privately shared some of his views, were reluctant to be associated with him publicly. His phone calls went unanswered, and he noticed people crossing the street to avoid walking past his house. One afternoon, as John sat on his porch nursing another drink, he was surprised to see his old partner Mike Sullivan approaching John. Mike said, his face grim, "We need to talk inside." Mike didn't mince words. "What the hell were you thinking, John? Do you have any idea how bad this looks for all of us?" John's face flushed with anger. "Don't tell me you're buying into this PC too, Mike. You know as well as I do what happens when they start moving in. Remember the Williams case?" Mike winced at the mention of the case that had defined both their careers 20 years ago. They had arrested a young black man named Tyrone Williams for a series of burglaries in a predominantly white neighborhood. The evidence had been circumstance at best, but they had been under intense pressure to make an arrest. Tyrone had spent 5 years in prison before being exonerated by DNA evidence. "That was different, John," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Was it?" John shot back. "We were protecting our community then, just like I'm trying to do now." As the two old partners argued, their raised voices carried across the street to where Marcus was working in his yard. He couldn't make out the words, but the angry tones sent a shiver down his spine. That evening, as Marcus was preparing dinner, his doorbell rang. He opened it to find Jake Martinez standing there looking uncomfortable. "Hey Marcus," Jake said, shifting from foot to foot. I overheard something today that I think you should know about." Over the next hour, Jake shared what he had learned about John's past as a police officer, including rumors of racial profiling and excessive force complaints. Marcus listened, his heart heavy. He had hoped that John's actions were an isolated incident, but it seemed the roots of his hatred ran deep. As the day of the community meeting approached, tensions in Oak reached a boiling point. Linda's mailbox was vandalized with the word "traitor" spray painted across it. Sarah Hawkins found her car tires slashed, and Marcus woke one morning to find a crude racial slur scrawled on his driveway. The night before the meeting, Marcus sat alone in his living room, questioning once again whether he had made the right decision in staying the warm, welcoming community he had dreamed of seemed further away than ever. Just as he was about to turn in for the night, Marcus heard a commotion outside. Hearing through his window, he saw John Hawkins stumbling down the street, clearly drunk. As John approached Marcus's house, he began shouting incoherently, his words slurred but filled with venom. Marcus watched, frozen, as several neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise. He saw Linda step forward, trying to calm John down, but the exop shoved her aside roughly. In that moment, something snapped inside Marcus. He couldn't stand by and watch anymore. Taking a deep breath, he opened his front door and stepped out onto his porch. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I think we need to talk." John whirled to face him, his bloodshot eyes wild with a mix of anger and something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Was it fear? As the two men stood facing each other in the darkness, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The confrontation that had been brewing since that first terrible day had finally arrived, and no one knew how it would end. The tense standoff between Marcus and John seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The air was thick with unspoken words and simmering emotions. Finally, it was Linda who broke the spell, stepping between the two men with her hands raised. "That's enough," she said firmly. "John, go home. You're drunk. Marcus, please go back inside. This isn't the time or place for this conversation." As the small crowd dispersed, Marcus caught Sarah's eye. She mowed silent, "I'm sorry." Before helping her father stumble back to his house, Marcus retreated inside, his mind racing. He knew that tomorrow's community meeting would be a turning point, not just for him but for all of Oak. The next morning, as Marcus prepared for the meeting, he found himself Reflecting on his own experiences with racism growing up in Atlanta, he had faced his share of prejudice, but nothing as blatant as what he'd encountered in Oak Ridge. He remembered the subtle slights in school, the teachers who seemed surprised when he excelled, the security guards who followed him in stores. He thought about his first job interview after college, where the interviewer had remarked, "You're very well spoken," with a tone of surprise that still made Marcus's blood boil. Years later, as he buttoned his shirt, Marcus steeled himself for what was to come. He had spent too many years staying quiet, trying not to rock the boat, but now, faced with such overt hatred, he knew he had to take a stand. The community center was packed when Marcus arrived. He could feel the weight of stares as he made his way to a seat near the front where Linda had saved him a spot. To his surprise, he saw John Hawkins slouched in a corner, looking haggard and hungover. As the meeting began, tensions quickly rose. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly resident who had been vocal in her opposition to Marcus, stood up. "I've lived in Oak for 40 years. She declared. "We've never had any trouble here. Now all of a sudden we have all this conflict." I think we all know why. Her words were met with a mix of murmurs of agreement and sounds of disgust. Jake Martinez jumped to his feet. "Are you kidding me? The only trouble here is the racism that's been hiding under the surface all along." The meeting devolved into chaos, with neighbors shouting over each other. Marcus sat silently watching the community he had hoped to join tear itself apart. Finally unable to bear it any longer, Marcus stood up. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "I understand that my presence here has caused some disruption," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "but I want you all to understand something. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not here to change your neighborhood. I'm here because I wanted a home just like all of you." He paused, looking around the room. "I've faced racism my entire life, but I've never let it stop me from pursuing my dreams. I worked hard to get where I am. I saved for years to buy a house in a nice neighborhood, and I have every right to live here just like each of you." As Marcus spoke, he noticed JN shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Marcus was surprised to see something like shame flicker across the older man's face. "I'm not asking you to like me," Marcus continued. "I'm not even asking you to accept me. All I'm asking is for the chance to be your neighbor, to contribute to this community, and to live in peace." As Marcus sat down, the room erupted in a mix of applause and angry muttering, but he had said his piece, and for the first time since moving to Oak Ridge he felt a sense of peace. The meeting continued, with various residents voicing their opinions. To Marcus' surprise, several of John's former colleagues spoke up, distancing themselves from his actions. "John's behavior doesn't represent the police force," one officer said firmly. "We're here to protect and serve all members of the community regardless of race." As the meeting wound down, Marcus noticed John slipping out the back door. Their confrontation would have to wait for another day. Over the next week, Marcus found himself the center of attention in Oak. Some neighbors went out of their way to show their support, bringing over baked goods or offering to help with yard work. Others continued to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him coming, but it was Linda who truly became his rock. She invited him over for dinner, introduced him to her book club, and fiercely defended him to anyone who dared speak against him in her presence. One evening, as they sat on Linda's porch enjoying a cool breeze, she turned to him with a serious expression. "Marcus," she said, "I want you to know how sorry I am, not just for what John did, but for my own ignorance. I've always considered myself open-minded, but this whole situation has made me realize how much I still have to learn." Marcus smiled, touched by her honesty. "We all have more to learn," he said gently. "The important thing is that we're willing to try." As they sat in companionable silence, Marcus spotted John across the street watching them from his window. The older man quickly ducked out of sight, but not before Marcus caught a glimpse of the conflicted expression on his face. Marcus sighed, realizing that despite the progress he'd made with some of his neighbors, the hardest conversation was still to come. He knew that for true change to happen in Oak, he would need to find a way to reach John Hawkins, but how could he bridge a gap built on decades of prejudice and fear? As the sun set over the quiet suburban street, Marcus steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead. The battle for acceptance in Oak Ridge was far from over, but for the first time since that terrible first day, he felt hope blooming in his chest. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. As the weeks passed, an uneasy calm settled over Oak. Marcus had begun to establish a routine, finding small moments of normalcy in his New life. However, the tension with John Hawkins remained a constant undercurrent. Like a storm brewing on the horizon one sweltering Saturday afternoon, Marcus was tending to his front yard when he heard a commotion down the street. Curious, he walked towards the source of the noise and saw a crowd gathering around the Thompson residential residence. As he approached, he overheard fragments of panicked conversation stuck inside. Someone was saying the fire department is on their way, but Marcus pushed through the crowd to get a better view. Smoke was billowing from an upstairs window of the Thompsons' house. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly resident who had been so vocal in her opposition to Marcus, was standing on the front lawn in her nightgown looking distraught. "My husband," she cried. "He's still inside. Please someone help him." Without thinking, Marcus sprinted towards the house. As he reached the front door, he felt a hand grab his arm. He turned to see John Hawkins, his face etched with concern. "You can't go in there," John said gruffly. "It's too dangerous." Marcus meant Junkscase. "Someone has to," he replied firmly. "Are you coming?" For a moment John hesitated, then with a curt nod he followed Marcus into the smoke-filled house. The heat was intense, and the thick smoke made it difficult to see or breathe. Marcus pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth, squinting through the haze. "Mr. Thompson," he called out. "Where are you?" A faint cough from upstairs answered him. Marcus and John exchanged a quick glance before heading towards the staircase. As they climbed, the smoke grew thicker and Marcus could feel the heat intensifying. They found Mr. Thompson collapsed in the hallway, barely conscious. Without a word, Marcus and John each took an arm and began to drag the elderly man towards the stairs. The journey back down seemed to take an eternity. The smoke was now so thick that Marcus could barely see John beside him. His lungs burned and his eyes stung, but he pushed on, driven by the urgent need to get Mr. Thompson to safety. As they finally stumbled out the front door, they were met with cheers from the gathered crowd. Paramedics rushed forward to take Mr. Thompson, and Marcus felt his knees buckle as the adrenaline began to wear off. To his surprise, it was JN who caught him, supporting his weight as they moved away from the house. As they collapsed on the grass, gasping for air, Marcus looked over at John. The older man's face was streaked with soot, his eyes red from the smoke, but there was something different in his expression now, a mix of respect and uncertainty that hadn't been there before. As the paramedics checked them over, Marcus noticed Mrs. Thompson approaching. Her eyes were filled with tears as she looked at both of them. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved Harold's life." I don't know what to say," Marcus nodded, still catching his breath. To his astonishment, Mrs. Thompson reached out and grasped his hand. "I've been so wrong," she whispered. "Can you ever forgive an old fool?" Before Marcus could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of news van. Reporters swarmed around them, shoving microphones in their faces and peppering them with questions. John stood up abruptly, looking uncomfortable with the attention. As he turned to leave, Marcus called out to him, "John, wait." The older man paused, looking back at Marcus with an unreadable expression. For a moment it seemed like he might say something, but then he shook his head and walked away, leaving Marcus to face the media frenzy alone. Later that evening, as Marcus sat on his porch nearing a cup of tea and reflecting on the day's events, he saw a figure approaching in the twilight. It was Sarah, John's daughter. "I heard what happened," she said, sitting down next to him. "That was incredibly brave." Marcus shrugged. "I just did what anyone would do." Sarah shook her head. "Not anyone, especially not after how this neighborhood has treated you." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I wanted to tell you something about my dad, something that might help you understand him a little better." As the night deepened around them, Sarah shared a painful story from John's past. Years ago, John's partner, a young black officer, had been killed in the line of duty. The incident had left John bitter and angry, causing him to retreat into a shell of prejudice and fear. "It doesn't excuse what he did to you," Sarah said firmly, "but I think today, well, I saw something in his eyes I haven't seen in years. You got through to him in a way I never could." As Sarah left, Marcus sat alone with his thoughts. The events of the day had shifted something in Oak Ridge. He could feel it, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. Across the street, John Hawkins sat in his darkened living room, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. His mind replayed the events of the day over and over, the fear, the smoke, the feeling of working side by side with Marcus to save a life. For the first time in years, JN felt the foundations of his long-held beliefs begin to crumble. As he stared out the window at Marcus's house, he realized that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to take the first step. The days following the fire at the Thompsons' house brought a noticeable shift to the atmosphere in Oak Ridge. Marcus found himself the recipient of grateful nods and tentative smiles from neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact. The story of his bravery, coupled with John Hawkins' unexpected assistance, had become the talk of the community. One morning as Marcus stepped out to collect his mail, he was surprised to see John standing awkwardly at the edge of his driveway. The older man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Morning," Marcus said, cautiously unsure of what to expect. Joan cleared his throat. "Morning," he replied gruffly. There was a long pause before he continued. I wanted to thank you for what you did at the Thompsons." That was something." Marcus nodded, sensing the effort it took John to say those words. "You were there too," he said simply. "We did it together." Another awkward silence fell between them. Finally John spoke again, his voice low. "Look, I know I've done some things I'm not proud of. I can't change the past," but he trailed off, seeming to struggle with his words. "But maybe we can work on the future," Marcus offered, extending his hand. John looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment before grasping it firmly. It wasn't for forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As the weeks passed, small changes began to take root in Oak. Marcus noticed John spending more time outside, tending to his lawn or washing his car. Occasionally they would exchange nods or brief greetings. It wasn't friendship, but it was a far cry from the hostility of their first encounter. Linda Ever, the community organizer, saw an opportunity in this thawing relation. She approached Marcus one evening with an idea. "I've been thinking," she said excitedly, "what if we organized a neighborhood diversity workshop, something to help people understand and appreciate our differences?" Marcus was hesitant at first, wary of putting himself in the spotlight again, but Linda's enthusiasm was infectious and he found himself agreeing to help. As they began planning the workshop, Marcus was surprised to find unexpected allies. Mrs. Thompson, still grateful for the rescue of her husband, offered to host the event in her newly repaired home. Jake Martinez volunteered to create flyers and spread the word on social media. Even more surprising was John's reaction when he heard about the workshop. Instead of the anger or dismissal Marcus had half expected, John merely nodded thoughtfully. "Might be good for the neighborhood," he said gruffly before retreating into his house. Sarah, who had become a frequent visitor to Marcus's home, was thrilled by her father's response. "I can't believe it," she said, her eyes shining with hope. "Dad's never been open to anything like this before. You're really getting through to him." Marcus, as the day of the workshop approached, Marcus found himself spending more time reflecting on his own experiences and biases. He realized that if he wanted others to examine their prejudices, he needed to be willing to confront his own. The night before the workshop, Marcus couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to say, all the experiences he wanted to share. As dawn broke, he made his way to the kitchen for a cup of coffee, only to find John already outside retrieving his newspaper. Their eyes met and Marcus was struck by the vulnerability he saw in the older man's face. Without thinking, he raised his mug in a silent invitation. To his surprise, John hesitated only briefly before making his way across the street. They sat on Marcus's porch in silence for a while, watching the neighborhood come to life around them. Finally John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I've lived with my beliefs for so long. I don't know how to be any different." Marcus felt a wave of empathy wash over him. "Change is scary," he agreed, "but it's also necessary, and you've already taken the first step by being willing to try." As they continued to talk, Marcus realized that this conversation, this honest, vulnerable exchange, was more powerful than any workshop could ever be. It was in these small moments, these quiet acknowledgments of fear and hope, that real change began to take root. When it was time for John to leave, he paused at the steps. "I don't know if I can come to the workshop," he said hesitantly, "but I'll try to keep an open mind." Marcus nodded, understanding the magnitude of that promise. As he watched John walk back to his house, he felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time it felt like they were all walking it together. That afternoon, as Marcus put the finishing touches on his presentation for the workshop, he received an unexpected text from Sarah. "DT's been reading about racial bias all morning. He's trying." "Marcus, he really is." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. The seeds of change had been planted in Oak Ridge, and though the harvest was still far off, the first tender shoots of understand were beginning to emerge. As night fell, Marcus stood at his window looking out at the quiet street. He thought about how far they'd come since that first terrible day and how far they still had to go, but for the first time since moving to Oak, he felt truly at home. Whatever challenges tomorrow's workshop might bring, he knew he was ready to face them, not alone but as part of a community That was slowly but surely learning to embrace its differences. The morning of the diversity workshop dawned bright and clear. Marcus stood in front of his mirror adjusting his tie and taking deep breaths to calm his nerves. The events of the past few weeks had given him hope, but he knew that today would be a crucial test for Oak. As he stepped outside, he was surprised to see John Hawkins emerging from his house at the same time. Their eyes met across the street, and for a moment, neither man moved. Then with a slight nod, John began walking towards the Thompson residence. Marcus felt a surge of emotion, pride, hope, and a touch of apprehension. As he followed, the Thompsons' living room was packed when they arrived. Linda had done an impressive job of getting the word out, and it seemed like most of Oak had turned up. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and nervous energy. As Linda called the meeting to order, Marcus scanned the room. He saw Jake and Sarah sitting together, offering him encouraging smiles. Mrs. Thompson bustled about making sure everyone had refreshments, and there in the back corner stood Jan, looking uncomfortable but present. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped to the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know this isn't an easy topic for many of us, but I believe it's an important conversation we need to have." As he spoke about his experiences both in Oak Ridge and throughout his life, Marcus could see the impact his words were having. Some people nodded in understanding while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but they were all listening. Halfway through his presentation, the door burst open. A man Marcus didn't recognize stormed in his face, or with anger. "What is this liberal propaganda?" he shouted. "We don't need this PC nonsense in our neighborhood." The room erupted into chaos. Some people tried to calm the man down while others voiced their agreement with him. Marcus stood frozen, unsure how to regain control of the situation. Suddenly a GRU voice cut through the noise. "That's enough, Bill." John Hawkins had stepped forward, placing himself between the angry man and Marcus. "You're out of line." Bill turned on JN, his eyes blazing. "You're defending him now, Hawkins? Have you forgotten everything we stood for?" Junk face hardened. "No, Bill, I'm remembering what we're supposed to stand for: protection, service, justice for everyone." The room fell silent, all eyes on the two men. Marcus watched, his heart pounding as JN took a deep breath and continued. "I've done a lot of thinking lately," John said, his voice rough with emotion, "and I've realized that I've been wrong about a lot of things." Marcus here. He paused, glancing back at Marcus. "He showed me what real courage looks like, and it's time I showed some of my own." John turned to face Marcus fully now, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything. I was scared and angry, and I took it out on you. There's no excuse for what I did, but I hope you can forgive me." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus felt as if the entire world had narrowed to this moment, this unexpected and profound apology. He stepped forward, extending his hand to John. "Forgiveness is a journey," he said softly, "but I'm willing to walk that path with you." As John grasped his hand, the room erupted into applause. Marcus saw tears in Linda's eyes, saw Sarah beaming with pride at her father. Even Mrs. Thompson was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The angry man Bill looked around the room, bewildered by the turn of events. Seeing no allies, he shuffled out, muttering under his breath. With the tension broken, the workshop took on a new energy. People began to share their own stories, their own struggles with prejudice and misunderstanding. Marcus listened, marveling at the honesty and vulnerability being displayed. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself in deep conversation with John. They talked about John's past, about the partner he had lost, about the fear and anger that had consumed him for so long, and for the first time Marcus truly understood the man behind the actions that had hurt him so deeply. When the workshop finally came to an end, the mood in Oak had shifted palpably. People lingered, forming small groups to continue their discussions. Marcus saw neighbors who had never spoken before exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet for coffee. As the last of the attendees trickled out, Linda approached Marcus, her eyes shining. "You did it," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You really did it." Marcus shook his head, smiling. "We did it," he corrected her, "all of us." Later that evening, as Marcus sat on his porch reflecting on the day's events, he saw John walking towards him. The older man sat down without a word, and for a while they simply sat in companionable silence. Finally John spoke. "I know one afternoon doesn't fix everything," he said quietly, "but I want you to know I'm committed to doing better, to being better." Marcus nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "That's all any of us can do," he replied. "Take it one day at a time." As they sat together watching the sun set over Oak, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted. The neighborhood that had once seemed so hostile now felt like a place of possibility, of growth, of hope. The journey was far from over, but today Oak had taken its first real steps towards becoming the community Marcus had always dreamed of calling home. The weeks following the diversity workshop brought a palpable change to Oak. The once quiet suburban streets now buzzed with a new energy as neighbors engaged in conversations that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Marcus found himself at the center of this transformation, a role he embraced with both excitement and a sense of responsibility. One sunny Saturday morning, Marcus was surprised to hear a knock at his door. He opened it to find John standing there, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. "Morning, Marcus," John said, clearing his throat. "I was wondering if you might want to join me for a cup of coffee. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Intrigued, Marcus agreed, and they made their way to the local diner. As they settled into a booth, JN took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, "about my past, about the things I've done, the people I've hurt, and I've realized that it's not enough to just say I'm sorry. I need to do something to make amends." Joan went on to explain that he had reached out to the Innocence Project, an organization that works to exonerate wrongly convicted individuals. He wanted to review some of his old cases to see if there were anywhere his prejudices might have led to wrongful convictions. Marcus listened, deeply moved by John's commitment to change. "That's incredible, John," he said. "It takes a lot of courage to confront your past like that." As they continued to talk, Marcus shared his own news. He had been approached by the local community college to teach a course on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It was an opportunity to extend the conversations they had started in Oak to a wider audience. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, her face glowing with excitement. "Dad, Marcus," she exclaimed, "I have amazing news." Sarah revealed that she was pregnant. The joy on Jay's face was unmistakable as he hugged his daughter tightly. "I'm going to be a grandfather," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they celebrated the news, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far they had all come. The man who had once spat in his face was now sharing one of life's most precious moments with him. Over the next few months, Oak Ridge continued to evolve. The neighborhood, watch once a source of tension, was restructured with a focus on community building rather than surveillance. Linda organized a series of cultural potlucks, encouraging neighbors to share their heritage through food and stories. Even Mrs. Thompson, who had once been one of Marcus' staunchest opponents, became an unexpected ally. She started a book club focused on diverse authors, inviting Marcus to lead discussions on works by James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. As summer turned to fall, Marcus found himself taking regular walks with JN. They would discuss everything from current events to personal philosophies, their conversations a testament to the power of open dialogue and mutual respect. One crisp autumn evening, as they strolled through the neighborhood, John suddenly stopped. "You know, Marcus," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you moved to Oak. You've changed this place and you've changed me." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "We've changed each other, John," he replied, "and we've changed this community together." As they continued their walk, Marcus reflected on the journey they had all taken. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. Prejudice and misunderstanding couldn't be erased overnight, but with every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of connection, they were building something beautiful. The climax of Oak's transformation came on a bright Saturday. In late September, the entire neighborhood had come together for a community fair celebrating their diversity and newfound unity. The streets were lined with booths showcasing different cultures, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and music. As Marcus walked through the fair, he was struck by the scenes around him. John was at the Innocence Project booth, passionately discussing criminal justice reform with a group of attentive listeners. Sarah, her baby bump now visible, was teaching a group of children how to make origami cranes. Linda and Mrs. Thompson were arm in arm planning their next community initiative. At the center of the fair, a large mural was being painted, designed collaboratively by the residents of Oak Ridge. It depicted a diverse group of people joining hands, with the words "unity and diversity" emblazoned across the top. As Marcus added his own brushstroke to the mural, he felt a sense of profound gratitude wash over him. This was the community he had always dreamed of, not perfect, but striving to be better, to be more inclusive, to be truly united. That evening, as the fair wound down, Marcus found himself back on his porch, the place where so much of this journey had begun. JN joined him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in brilliant hues. "You know," Marcus said, Finally, when I first moved here, I never could have imagined this. There were moments when I thought about leaving, when it all seemed too hard." JN nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm glad you stayed," he said simply as they sat there. Marcus realized that Oak had become more than just a place to live. It had become a home, a community, a family. The journey had been difficult, filled with pain and confrontation, but it had led to something beautiful and profound. The story of Oak Ridge wasn't over in many ways, it was just beginning. But as Marcus looked out at the neighborhood he now truly called home, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In the distance, a baby's cry pierced the evening air. Sarah's child, the newest member of their community. Marcus smiled, thinking of the world this child would grow up in, a world that, while not perfect, was striving every day to be better, more understanding, more inclusive. And in that moment, Marcus knew that the true power of change lay not in grand gestures, but in the small daily acts of kindness, understanding, and love. It lay in the courage to confront our biases, the willingness to listen and learn, and the strength to stand up for what is right. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Marcus and John sat in companionable silence, two men from different worlds who had found common ground, and in their silence was a promise to continue this journey, to keep learning, to keep growing, and to never stop working towards a better, more inclusive world. This is the end of this wonderful story. I hope you liked it, and you were imbued with this atmosphere. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as it promotes my video. Thank you everyone for watching. Bye everyone.